So let's begin with the poem. Do not ask me the why and the wherefore. Poetry is anotic. You might as well question the rooster or the plums. Why they put why they put on spring blossoms. So he begins with the answer of a question. And the question I can assume, we can only assume and make an educated guess is, why do you write poetry? So someone asked Nongkynrih why he writes poetry. And he says, don't ask me that question. It's like asking why something like this happens or why something like that happens, and whatever this and that is, he give you multiple examples. He says that poetry has no reason or cognizant logical reason for being written. I cannot give you a proper reason for taking that decision. But how and when poetry first came to me, if you insist, let me flip through the folios of memory. So I cannot tell you how I began to write or why I began to write. I cannot tell you why I write poetry, but I can tell you, I can go back to my memories and I can try to recall how poetry came to me and when poetry came to me. He goes on to say in the next few stanzas, he will be giving instances of poetry when it did not come to him. So first he is going to tell the readers when poetry did not come to him, and then in the end he will tell the readers when poetry came to him. So first he says, poetry did not come beckoning like the hills in my blood. It did not come on the fragile wings of a cicada. I cannot pronounce that word. It's, I think, Nongkynrih. It means an insect, a cicada, an insect. So poetry did not come from the hills. Poetry did not come on the wings of a certain insect singing of autumn in the autumn weather when there are many insects, when we are covered with mosquitoes and other forms of insects, grasshoppers, all of these. It did not come from the sunny streams, naked and splashing with childhood. So now he's going back to his memories and trying to recall when poetry came to him. He cannot answer why he started writing poetry, but he's trying to answer when poetry came to him. He's trying to answer that particular question. And he says that did not happen in the hills. Poetry did not come to him there. Poetry did not travel to him on the wings of a particular insect. Poetry did not come to him in the sunny weather when he was a child. I was talking about how Nongkynrih, he says that somebody asked him a question, and in response to that, he says that don't ask me poetry, why I write poetry. He says, I cannot tell you that. I do not have an answer to that. But I can try to answer when and how poetry first came to me. I'll just have to go back to my memories. And then he starts going back to the memories and talks of, in the next two or three stanzas, he talks of when poetry did not come to him. So he says, poetry did not come to him in the hills, poetry did not come to him on the wings of a certain insect, on the wings of a cicada. Poetry did not come to him in the sunny weather during his childhood. It did not come to him in the afternoon bonfires and the sweet burning faggot smoke sinking to my bones and rising above woods wobbling with winter. So during the winter months, when they created a bonfire, they created a fire out of the logs of woods and sat around it to get themselves certain warmth. Poetry did not come to him then. This poetry, this act of writing poetry, did not come to him. Though all these are dearest to my heart, it did not come from the deep deciduous gorges, soaring and animated like migratory birds looking for ripening fruits in sanctified groves. So all these memories that he's talking about, the hills, about the trees, about the sunny streams, they are all very precious memories. All these memories are very dear to him. Lekin, he says, poetry did not come to him during these times. It did not fill the inhospitable मतलब जहाँ पे कोई रह ना सके. It did not fill the inhospitable ravines of my soul with the fullness of land clouds. तो जैसे कोई रवाइन होता है उसमें लैंड क्लाउड्स उसको उसमें लैंड क्लाउड्स से वो फिल होता है. सो ही सेज पोएट्री डिड नॉट फिल द ravines of his souls. It did not come to him then either. तो उसने बहुत सारे एग्जाम्पल दिए. एक कोई बहुत ही डीप, बहुत ही नैरो एक कोई गॉर्ज हो विद वेरी steep and very deep and narrow gorge, that's a ravine, a very deep and narrow valley जो कि बहुत ही ज्यादा steep हो, that's called a ravine. So that ravine was not filled by the land clouds of poetry. He says that the valley of my heart was not the valley of my soul was not filled by poetry back then. मतलब कि उसने अपनी जितनी अब तक की मेमोरीज बताई, memories of hills, memories of insects, memories of bonfires, nowhere did poetry fill his soul. Though I am a true son of the wettest place on earth, it did not come baptizing like the wind-driven rain and the impregnating fog. So he says कि even though I consider myself belonging to earth, belonging to this region, because I have such happy memories with it, poetry did not come to me in all of these regions. It happened amidst the squalor of this town's wretched tenements. So far उसने ये बताया था कि पोएट्री उसको कहाँ कहाँ नहीं मिली. Where did poetry not come to him? अब वो बताने जा रहा है कि where did poetry ultimately come to him? उसको पोएट्री मिली कहाँ? Where did he find poetry? Right. So he says कि in the squalor यानी कि गरीबी में कहीं पे amidst the squalor of the town's wretched tenements यानी कि in a very dirty place, dirty because it's the place where the rich do not dwell, like slums which are very crowded. So एक के बाद छोटी छोटी झुग्गियां होती है perhaps. So वैसा कुछ एक टेनेमेंट है, वैसा एक बिल्डिंग है जिसमें बहुत छोटे छोटे कमरे हैं, which is a place where the poor live, not the rich, which is a place which is maybe not dirty, which is maybe filled by people who are very poor, maybe wretched because they're living their poor lives. उस जगह पर उसको शायद पोएट्री मिली. उस जगह पर Nongkynrih says poetry came to him, perhaps, but not because life was harsh. उस जगह पर इसलिए नहीं क्योंकि जितने भी ये गरीब लोग थे उनकी जिंदगी बहुत मुश्किल थी. And ignoble for a strange and ragged rustic struggling by a day student, a nighttime laborer. Not because he was one of those people, one of those poor people, and by poor I mean somebody who does not have money. He wasn't one of those poor people who lived in such tenements. छोटी छोटी झुग्गियां में भी छोटा छोटा बहुत ही क्राउडेड एक अपार्टमेंट मान लो जिसमें बहुत छोटे छोटे कमरे हों जहाँ पे लोग रहते हों. So he lived there and poetry came to him there, but not because that life was harsh, and not because he was somebody who was struggling to live there. दिन में he used to work as a student. He used to maybe go to his place of education and he used to also work for a living at night. So he was a nighttime laborer for a strange, rugged rustic. तो ये क्या कर रहे हैं यहाँ पे? The idea of, ragged, rustic, एक atmospheric, how how do I put it? A kind of romanticization कि the poor are rich by heart, the poor are this, the poor are that. एक romantic सा जो एक आइडिया होता है जो कि पुअर के बारे में हम लोग रखते हैं, उसको वो क्वेश्चन कर रहे हैं कि हाँ जिंदगी हार्श थी, एज अ पुअर पर्सन लाइफ वाज हार्श, बट दैट्स नॉट व्हाई पोएट्री केम टू मी. सो ही इज गोइंग डायरेक्टली अगेंस्ट द रोमांटिक प्रीसेप्ट सेट बाय सम वेरी नोटेबल रोमांटिक राइटर्स, जैसे कि वर्ड्सवर्थ. वो क्या कहता है? वर्ड्सवर्थ कहता है कि शहरों में जो लोग रहते हैं, पैसे वाले लोग, दे आर रिच, दे हैव क्रूअल हार्ट्स. लेकिन जो गांव में रहते हैं वो लोग पुअर होते हैं एंड दे लिव वेरी सिंपल रस्टिक लाइव्स, एंड बिकॉज ऑफ दैट दे आर बेटर पोएट्स एंड दे देयर लाइव्स डिजर्व टू बी डॉक्यूमेंटेड. उसको ऐसा लगता है, वर्ड्सवर्थ को ऐसा लगता है. यहाँ पर नॉन्किनरी उसको एग्जैक्टली क्वेश्चन कर रहा है कि क्या ऐसा सचमुच है. सो ही सेज ऐसा नहीं है. पोएट्री केम टू मी इन सच अ प्लेस वेयर I lived in a very poor colony. It came to me there. Life was harsh, but ऐसा कुछ poetic वो जगह. To him, it wasn't like that. To him, it wasn't like what Wordsworth would have the readers believe. Not because everything had seemed to mock me. So poetry came to me in that place, in that wretched place, in that place of squalor and poverty. बट इसलिए नहीं क्योंकि आई वॉज स्ट्रगलिंग एज अ स्टूडेंट इन द डे एंड अ वर्कर, अ लेबरर एट नाइट, एंड ऑल्सो नॉट बिकॉज जो लोग भी मुझे देखते थे दे यूज्ड टू मेक फन ऑफ मी, दे वुड मॉक मी. हु वुड मॉक मी? Rich girls giggling on the road, to loud boys on bicycle, and young louds playing badminton. These are all examples of people who would mock me. These people are richer than him and they have not experienced his poverty. So ये लोग उसका मजाक उड़ाते थे. कौन कौन उड़ाता था? Rich girls giggling. So imagine पू जैसी कोई लड़की, अगर कौन सी पिक्चर है वो, कभी खुशी कभी गम में. So somebody who's rich, or if you've seen Mean Girls, somebody like them, they would laugh at him, they would giggle at him on the road. और maybe कोई boys हैं जो कि साइकिल चला रहे हैं, their parents have bought them cycles, they come from richer households, they also made fun of him. या फिर कोई और कुछ लोग बैडमिंटन खेल रहे हैं, they would make fun of him. Why is that? Because he's poor. He's a poor student who lives in an accommodation meant for poor people. And that is where poetry came to him. But not because his life was harsh, not because he was struggling as a student and a worker, and also not because ये सारे लोग उसका मजाक उड़ाते थे. Bad times might have ruled out a normal existence and driven me up the branches of a pear tree to peer at the playful world with timid longing. तो क्या क्या कह रहा है अब ये कि बैड टाइम्स माइट हैव रूल्ड आउट अ नॉर्मल एग्जिस्टेंस, क्योंकि मैंने जिंदगी में ऐसा खराब समय देखा है जब मैं इतना गरीब था कि एक नॉर्मल एग्जिस्टेंस जिसको हम और तुम इमेजिन कर सकते हैं वो मेरे पास नहीं था. मेरे पास वो नॉर्मल स्टूडेंट होने का, स्टूडेंट लाइफ एंजॉय करने का वो ऑप्शन मेरे पास नहीं था, बिकॉज आई वॉज पुअर. एंड दीज बैड टाइम्स, जो मैंने खराब समय देखा है जहाँ पे मेरे पास पैसा कम था, these bad times drove me up the branches of a pear tree to peer at the playful world with timid longing. तो मैं क्या करता था उस खराब समय में? इस खराब समय की वजह से मैं pear tree के ऊपर चढ़ के peer करता था पूरी दुनिया को. यहाँ पे peer word देखो, एक हुआ pear tree, pear being the fruit, एक हुआ peer यानी कि देखना, to see, चुपके चुपके देखना. तो मैं उस पेड़ ट्री पे चढ़ के, उस पेड़ पे चढ़कर अब बाकी के दुनिया को देखता था, जहाँ पे दुनिया में ऐसे लोग हैं जिनके पास थोड़ा सा मुझसे पैसा ज्यादा है, और मैं लॉन्ग करता था, मैं उसकी उम्मीद करता था कि काश मैं भी वैसा होता, काश मैं भी थोड़ा पैसे वाला होता, इतना पुअर नहीं होता. सो आई वुड look at this playful world from my harsh world and wish for it. Long for this world. Long for a world where I had a little more money perhaps. I was in a better situation perhaps. मुझे एज अ स्टूडेंट एंड एज अ लेबरर दोनों टाइम काम नहीं करना पड़ता. मुझे ऐसे फिल्थी स्कॉलर, फिल्थी नहीं बोला बेचारे ने, मैं पता नहीं क्यों बार बार उसके अकोमोडेशन को फिल्थी करती हूँ. मुझे ऐसे स्कॉलर में ऐसे घुट घुट के एक जगह पे जहाँ पे बहुत ही सारे लोग एक छोटी सी एक कोठी में शायद रहते हैं, एक स्लम एरिया जैसा कुछ को मान लो, मेरे को वहां नहीं रहना पड़ता. तो मैं आई वुड लॉन्ग फॉर a more playful world. I would look at that world, I would gaze at it, and I would long for it. But poetry did not come because bad times also made me supple as a cane stalk and taught me the relief of stories and pleasures conjured with closed eyes. लेकिन इतना खराब समय भी जब मैंने देखा, तब भी poetry did not come to me because of this bad time. Why is that? क्योंकि ये जो बैड टाइम मैंने देखा, ये जो खराब समय मैंने देखा, इट मेड मी वेरी रेजोल्यूट, इट मेड मी स्ट्रॉन्ग एंड इट टॉट मी कि किस तरह आंखें बंद कर कर कहानियां बुनकर उसमें से थोड़ी सी खुशी हम लोग ले सकते हैं. खुशी. सो he'd close his eyes, he'd try to think of the pleasures from, try to gather pleasure from certain stories that he'd make up. So even in the bad times, he was resolute, and for that reason, poetry did not come to him due to his bad times. Poetry did not come because of the joys and sorrows of my life, though later it soaked in everything like plowed earth and mirrored everything like a mountain lake. So because of जिंदगी में मेरे जो सुख दुख थे, उनकी वजह से पोएट्री मेरे पास नहीं आई. उनकी वजह से आई डिड नॉट start writing poetry or became a poet, whatever. It did not happen because of the joys and sorrows of my life. Although ये मैं जरूर कहूँगा कि later on in life when poetry had come to me, उसने सब कुछ मेरी जिंदगी में जो कुछ भी हुआ, अच्छा बुरा, मेरी जिंदगी की हंसी खुशी सुख दुख दोनों ही एक खुदी हुई अर्थ की तरह उसमें अपने में सोख लिया, ले लिया. जैसे कि कहीं गड्ढा है, गड्ढे में कुछ भी डालो डल जाएगा, राइट? उस तरीके से पोएट्री ने गड्ढे की तरह सब कुछ ले लिया, लाइक अ प्लाउड अप अर्थ. और पोएट्री ने when it came to me finally, not because of the joys and sorrows, it took up all of these aspects of my life and reflected them back. जैसे कि कोई माउंटेन्स के पास कोई लेक होता है, वो पूरा का पूरा अपने आसपास का लैंडस्केप उस लेक में दिखाई देता है. सो पोएट्री ऑल्सो जस्ट लाइक दैट लेक mirrored or reflected all of these joys and sorrows of my life. When it came, it had nothing of leaders with lips of a murmuring brook and hearts laced with venom like the arrows of war. जब poetry came to me, it wasn't like a leader जिसके मुंह पे कहते हैं ना, मुंह में राम बगल में छुरी, वैसा हो, जिसके lips of a murmuring brook and hearts, लिप्स पे बहुत सारे प्रोमिसेस हो, मर्मरिंग हो, मतलब बहुत ही ज्यादा प्रोमिसेस हो, प्लेजेंट हो, बट दिल में जिसके जहर हो. वेनम विद laced with venom. Venom is poison, like the arrows of a war. किस तरह का जहर? जैसे कि लड़ाई में, किसी जंग में कोई तीर है, उस तीर को किस में डिप करते हैं? पॉइजन में, और फिर ओपोनेंट को मारते हैं ताकि ओपोनेंट को अगर लगे भी, कहीं नॉन फेटल जगह लगे तो भी ओपोनेंट को वो फेटल लगे. इसलिए उस एरो को जहर में डिप करके अपने ओपोनेंट को मारते हैं. सो दीज लीडर्स, they also have hearts laced with poison, and these hearts are compared to arrows of war, weapons of war. It carried nothing of the cold and hard indifference that drove students to the streets and boys to the therapy of the gun. Right. So जब poetry आई, it did not have जिस तरीके का सख्ती, जिस तरीके का अनकेयरिंग नेचर स्टूडेंट्स का हो जाता है कि वो सड़कों पर उतर आते हैं और बंदूकें उठा लेते हैं. So he's talking about resurgent areas. He's talking about areas like maybe I think कश्मीर में कहीं कहीं मैंने सुना है. So certain areas like that, some areas in the northeast as well, where students pick up guns for whatever reasons. Maybe they are misguided. So they get on the streets and they pick up guns because उनके दिल को इतना कठोर बना दिया गया है. So poetry did not come to him because of this. It had nothing to do. It had nothing of the rottenness that would sell our holy mountain for a car and a few concubines. तो ये जो एक तरीके का सड़न है, एक तरीके का करप्शन है, which would sell away our holy mountains for a very menial cost, for nothing, सिर्फ अपने पर्सनल गेन्स के लिए, जैसे कि किसी कार के लिए या फिर फॉर अ प्रोस्टिट्यूट और टू, फॉर अ गर्ल और टू मे बी. ऐसा कोई भी ऐसा करप्शन की वजह से पोएट्री मेरे पास नहीं है. इट डिड नॉट, माय पोएट्री डिड नॉट हैव दैट काइंड ऑफ करप्शन, दैट काइंड ऑफ रॉटननेस. वैसी सडन मेरी पोएट्री में नहीं थी. It had nothing of blood or riots. So my poetry did not have riots in it. Like मैंने जब जो भी absorb किया अपनी life में, my poetry also absorbed it. किस तरह like a mountain lake, किस तरह like a steep valley. Right, it absorbed all of that. But it did not take up these instances of militancy where young boys take guns to the street or where there are blood and riots everywhere or there are curfews. Nothing of public or private curfews. तो एक इस तरीके को के एरिया को डिस्क्राइब कर रहे हैं. ये डिस्क्राइब कर रहे हैं ऐसे एरिया को जहाँ पर इतने रायट्स होते हैं, इतना ब्लडशेड होता है कि कर्फ्यू लग जाते हैं. और क्या होता है, वहाँ के जो भी लीडर्स हैं वो करप्ट होते हैं और छोटी सी चीज के लिए वो लोग इस एरिया को बेच देते हैं. एक तरीके से दे सेल द एरिया ऑफ, नॉट लिटरली पैसे लेके, बट दे ये उस एरिया का सौदा कर देते हैं ऐसे लीडर्स जहाँ पर होते हैं. सो ही इज ट्राइंग टू पोर्ट्रे a kind of a militancy area and how sad and sorrowful life is in such an area, in such a region of fake or genuine encounters. जो वहाँ पर क्या होता है, these he proposes कि ऐसे एरिया में झूठे एनकाउंटर करके जो मिलिट्री होती है वो लोगों को मार देती है. तो दिस इज हिज आइडिया कि ऐसा एक कोई रीजन है, कोई मिलिटेंसी एरिया है where such things happen. Nothing of life or death, nothing good or bad, nothing beautiful or ugly. So he's proposing such an area where life is so harsh, where he has lived in such a manner, in squalor, in poverty, where war happens a lot, where छोटे बच्चे जो होते हैं, boys जो होते हैं, they take up gun and go to the street because their hearts have been turned cold and indifferent. By what? By these leaders who are so corrupt. They sell away their lands, they sell away their occupancies, and they sell away their cities and states जिनके भी वो leaders हैं, जहाँ पे riots बहुत होते हैं, जहाँ पे bloodshed होता है, जिसके कारण curfews होते हैं, जहाँ पे the military leaders, these military leaders and the military, they cause fake encounter. Encounter क्या होता है कि किसी को ड्यू टू सर्टेन रीजंस किसी को वहीं की वहीं मार डालना, उसका एनकाउंटर कर देना. So he says my poetry does not have all of these aspects. It does not take from these aspects. Finally अब जाके नॉन्किनरी बताता है कि पोएट्री आई कहाँ से. Where did he ultimately get his poetry from? And he says that poetry came like an illness. एक बीमारी की तरह मुझे पोएट्री लग गई बस. And he continues, a young woman, abandoned and alone with her girl child, had seemed to me in her loneliness like a flambeau in the dark lanes of those nights. So finally, he's telling us कि poetry आई कहाँ से? Where did he find poetry in his life? And he now suggests कि एक कोई young woman है. There's this young woman. We will later find out that she's a divorcee, and she has a very young girl child as well. So there is a young woman who has been abandoned, who is lonely, who's alone, who has no family maybe. She is such kind of a person. And she has a very young daughter. In her loneliness, she appeared to him like a flambeau in the dark lanes of the night. रात के अंधेरे में वो एक रोशनी की तरह थी. Flambeau is a flame. It's a torch. So वो जो एक लड़की थी, वो जो एक औरत थी, महिला थी, who was abandoned and alone herself, who had a young daughter, she was like light in the dark lanes of those particular nights when all of these terrorizing activities were happening. Something stirred inside me, जिसने उसके अंदर का कुछ जगा दिया. Something stirred. Stir मतलब जैसे कि दाल बनाई है, stir करना मतलब उसको थोड़ा हिलाना. तो अंदर उसके एक तरीके से कुछ something stirred, कुछ हिला, कुछ अंदर उसे feel हुआ. I was racked by a sudden desolate yearning, something fierce and restless, a gnawing, tormenting desire to reach out, to touch. और उसको एक कुछ फील हुआ, और वो क्या फील हुआ? एक तरीके का एक yearning फील हुआ. To yearn for something is to really want something. किसी चीज का बहुत याद आना, उसे मिस करना, उसे पाना, बहुत ज्यादा अंदर से वो फीलिंग आना. So he yearned for something. He had this sudden yearning जो कि पहले नहीं थी, जो कि उस महिला को देखकर उसमें आई. And it was very fierce, it was very powerful and restless, जो कि कहीं भी जा नहीं रही थी, जो कि थोड़ी देर के लिए भी शांत नहीं हो रही थी. एक अंदर से खा जाना. Gnawing मतलब to gnaw at someone else, उसको खाना, धीरे धीरे खाना. So this feeling of yearning, it would gnaw at him. उसको अंदर से खा रही थी, उसको torment कर रही थी. This desire to reach out, किसी तरह उस महिला के पास उससे बात करना, to reach out to this woman and to touch. And I scrawled my first few lines. And furtive, like someone committing a crime, I slipped them through the door of her 2-room residence. और मैंने क्या किया? चुपके से, जैसे कि मान लो कोई चोर है, चोरी करता है, ऐसे चोर की तरह मैंने कुछ लाइनें लिखी और चुपके चुपके चोर की तरह मैं उसके घर के दरवाजे के नीचे से मैंने वो लाइनें अंदर सरका दी. I slipped them through the door of her 2-room residence. I think this is missing a page. Let me check if it's missing a page. अभी तक कोई क्वेश्चन है? We are coming to the end of the poem. अभी तक कोई क्वेश्चन है?
No, ma'am.
None so far. This is clear, right? ये poem अब तक clear है.
Yes,
Oh,
ma'am.
this is because the reason ये इतना छोटा दिया है is because you have a fragment of it. अच्छा, what I'm going to do is थोड़ा सा ना यहाँ पे missing है somehow. एक छोटा सा स्टैंजा मिसिंग है, मैं वो रीड कर दूंगी. मुझे लग ही रहा था कि ऐसे कैसे हो गया. सो इट सेज, मैं रीड कर रही हूँ, ध्यान से सुनना. That was my poetry, nakedly, madly in love and desperately prayerful. But in its foolishness, it did not even have a name. And my beloved looked in vain for the man who had called her. My first poem, Light in the Night. Right. तो आई थिंक एक लास्ट लाइन बच गई, बाकी सारा गायब हो गया. मैं दोबारा रिपीट करती हूँ. That was my poetry, nakedly, madly in love and desperately prayerful. तो उस महिला के लिए, उस औरत के लिए, उस वुमन के लिए मैंने जो पोइट्री लिखी थी, 4-5 लाइन जो मैंने लिखी थी, और मैं चुपके चुपके उसके घर के दरवाजे के नीचे से उसको सड़का कर आया था, वो मेरी पोइट्री थी. दैट इज व्हेन पोइट्री केम टू मी. नेकेडली, मैडली इन लव एंड डेस्परेटली प्रेयरफुल. किसको वो प्रे कर रहा है? नॉट टू अ गॉड, किसी गॉड को प्रे नहीं कर रहा है. इट इज प्रेयरफुल टुवर्ड्स दिस widow, so is widow nahi, sorry, divorcee woman, this woman who is young, alone and with a daughter, who is lonely, but who is to him the light in the dark lanes of these nights. For her he wrote his first poetry, Lekin, but in its foolishness did not even have a name. So this poetry that he wrote, अपनी भूल से, अपनी फुलिशनेस से, उसमें उसका नाम नहीं था. उसमें Nongkynrih did not write the name, or the poet did not write his own name in that poem. And my beloved looked in vain for the man who had called her my first poem, Light in the Light. Right, so उसने वो कविता तो उस तक भिजवा दी कि उसने वो पेपर पे लिख के सच डाल दी, but in his foolishness he forgot to write his name. And the woman, she looked for the man who wrote it. She tried to look around क्योंकि उसमें नाम नहीं था, but by then he had already given her the poem. He had already given her, the very first few lines that he wrote. His first poem, Light in the Night, about this particular woman. He had already given it to her, but he forgot to write his name. Well, as you can see, when I was young, my poetry started with an address to a divorcee, a woman old enough to be my aunt. So, जब मैं young था, my poetry began, my very first poem was to this woman who was old enough to be my aunt, who was a divorcee who had a young daughter. Now that I'm almost old, should I turn to a girl, hopefully a virgin, and young enough to be my student? तो क्या जब मैं इतना young था, and I wrote poetry for a woman old enough to be my aunt, अब तो मैं old हूँ, now I am old. So does this mean कि अगर हम लोग वही laws follow कर रहे हैं, अगर ये एक समाज की कोई law है या एक कोई धारणा है, तो अब तो इसका मतलब ये होना चाहिए कि I should now approach a young girl, right? And this young girl should be young enough to be my student. Should I approach her? Maybe someone like you, maybe somebody like the reader or the person who has given the question. This is unclear क्योंकि ये क्या है, ये conversation हो रहा है, ये conversation का reply है. तो जिस भी इंसान ने, maybe this person is a woman and she has asked him, when did you start writing poetry? And he says, maybe I should, give my affections to you. Maybe I should start writing poetry to you, sipping wine and smoking a cigarette. So this is now describing the person who has asked this question. She is also a girl. She's sipping wine and she's smoking a cigarette. So he says, if those laws are to be followed and ordained, should I now write my poetry for a girl young enough to be my student? Or somebody like you who has asked a question? Or somebody like you? For I have gone down the ladder and crawled into the coal pits of my psyche. Coal pits of psyche, sorry. But did I ever tell you that you make me feel stupidly innocent and hopelessly inadequate? So now he's writing this poem for someone, right? And he says, I have gone down the ladder and crawled into the coal pits of psyche. यानी कि मैंने घाट घाट का पानी पिया है, एक तरीके से he's trying to say. घाट घाट का पानी पिया है, मुझे काफी एक्सपीरियंस है दुनिया का, दुनियादारी का, लेकिन तुम्हारे साथ बैठकर मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि मुझे कुछ नहीं आता. In a manner of speaking, that's what he's saying. That I have gone down the pits of psyche. I have learned all there is to learn. But even then, You make me feel very innocent. Somebody who has not had any experience of life and of love. You also make me feel inadequate. Somebody who's not enough, or at least not good enough. So perhaps he is writing this poem as a response to a question by a young woman. Who is this woman? This woman could be possibly a lover who makes him feel these feelings of being inadequate, of being innocent, despite the fact that he's an old man now and he has already experienced all these feelings.